Hey guys, let's wrap up this lesson on community dynamics. So far, you've learned about what succession is, primary versus secondary succession, and then of course within secondary succession, you've learned about early versus late versus mature. In the second video, you saw some examples of succession taking place in your own town, or at least where campus is and in the surrounding land. Um, I would finally like to wrap up with just a couple more concepts and take a look at some graphs together. So when we looked at the Pine Barrens, at the local environment and different successional stages throughout it, we saw that disturbance can be in the form of fire, of course. It can be in the form of clear cutting to build a shopping complex or a new Starbucks. It can be in the form of mowing. Okay, so I showed you different stages, which of course implies that there's a different frequency of disturbance, no matter what that disturbance is. And so we can look at this graphically, like this right here. Each one of these arrows here over time represents some kind of disturbance, a fire, mowing, clear cutting, whatever. And each one of these colors represents a new species. Uh, of course, when the disturbance is frequent, right? So like the experiments on campus, some of the forests are burned on purpose, so prescribed burned every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. And so when that disturbance regime is frequent enough, that is going to eliminate other species from being able to grow, species that are not adapted to that frequent disturbance, particularly in the form of fire. And so the more frequently disturbances occur, the diversity of species is going to stay lower. On the other end of the spectrum, if there is no disturbance, right, we can see that there's no disturbance that would take place here, we start to see other species that are able to colonize the area. And so these presumably would be less disturbance adapted, right, so later successional species, and oftentimes these are a little bit more slowly growing. But once they do grow, they shade out other species. And so we can see that those species that are adapted to the high disturbance regime, they are going to be outcompeted. And so in the mature forest, we're not going to see those um, early successional species, the eastern red cedar, the pitch pine, but instead we're going to see these later successional species. And so overall, when we think about this in terms of diversity, in terms of species richness, we can see that if there is no disturbance, also diversity is going to decline. So there's kind of a sweet spot in the middle, which of course, again, is what some of the experiments on campus are looking at, just how frequently should a disturbance happen to maximize diversity and provide enough diverse habitats for other organisms. And so here we can see that if we spread out the disturbances, right, so maybe half as frequent, so instead of 2 years, maybe 4 years or 5 years, what we can see is that all five of these hypothetical species are able to live when the disturbance regime is a little bit slower. And so this gives rise to what is called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which of course states that the highest diversity is seen at some kind of an intermediate frequency of disturbance. Okay, so it's not too hot, it's not too cold, but somewhere right in the middle. So we've been talking a lot about human-driven disturbances and human-driven successional changes, but there are there's a variety of different drivers of succession. And so we can classify succession and the drivers of it as autogenic or allogenic. And so autogenic is essentially where the environment itself is created by the organisms within the community. And so it is the community itself that is automatically generating these different successional stages. And so as the species in the community change over succession, the environmental conditions are also going to be changed. We can, of course, think about the grassy field with the occasional eastern red cedar within it. Those environments don't have a lot of shade, and so there's going to be a lot of heat. It'll be drier than it would be in a later successional stage a more mature forest. And so again, as successional stages develop, as the forest, as the community ages, there are going to be changes in light, there are going to be changes in nutrient availability, and this itself gives rise to more successional changes. So something that we talked about at the very beginning of the semester, and something that I want to loop back around to, is changes in benthic community types. So benthic, kind of the floor of the ocean, floor of a lake. And so what we actually see is that the community at the bottom of a large body of water, it is going to undergo successional changes as well. And these changes are autogenic. It is the actual organisms themselves that are changing the environmental conditions and therefore giving rise to other communities, making the environment prone to support other organisms. And so I just want to give you a little bit of background here in this graph. Of course, there's a lot going on in this graph, but essentially over here, this is when the floor of a large body of water would initially be colonized. And then over time, the community, the genera, the organisms that can actually live in that environment are going to change. And so, here is the next successional stage, and then the next one that's at equilibrium, or essentially it is going to be supported in the long term. It is a mature community. All right, so that's one thing that we can see. Another thing we can see is deoxygenated sediment. So how thick is the layer of sediment that is not oxygenated? It is anaerobic. And so as we know, not many organisms, at least not the organisms that we would think as big and charismatic and super active, are able to live in these really low oxygen environments. And so what we can see here, what I want to focus on, is that when a benthic community is first established, the deoxygenated sediments are really thick. Okay, so again, anaerobic, only certain organisms are able to live, but these organisms, just by living there, are going to tunnel down into the sediment. They are going to open up that space. They're going to, create turbulence within the sediment, and that in and of itself is going to bring oxygen into the sediments. And so we can see that, the floor is about the same level, but the oxygen is going to penetrate deeper and deeper just by the action of these group 1 genera. Okay, so again, this is an autogenic environmental change. It is the organisms themselves that are changing the environment. And of course, as the depth of the oxygenated sediment increases, this is going to be able to support kind of more active and larger organisms, ones that we might, associate with these environments a little bit more. These are the group 2 genera. And again, just based on their activities, just based on their metabolisms, they are going to oxygenate the sediment, increasing the depth and therefore promoting the colonization of these group 3 genera. Right? Again, the ones that are the most recognizable in these environments, they are at equilibrium. But of course, they are super active and therefore they need oxygen. And so they can only exist, they can only be sustained in an oxygenated environment. And so again, earlier this semester, literally our first couple classes together, we read an article on the spreading dead zones. And we looked at one of the graphs in that paper, and we talked a lot about how anthropogenic effects as well as natural seasonal effects can lead to a decrease in oxygen in the water. And a lot of that is due to eutrophication or algal blooms. But there was one other graph in that paper, and that is this one right here. And so now that we know a little bit more about succession within a marine environment, from these group 1 genera who can exist in an anaerobic environment versus these group 3 genera. These are the mature community members, and they need a lot of oxygen. And so when we go to this graph now, we can see that on the y-axis there is community maturity. So group 1 genera generally can live in anaerobic environments, group 2 and group 3. And on the x-axis, we can see normoxia. So this is how much oxygen should be in these marine environments. Hypoxia, which we know can be stimulated by both seasonal effects, right? A little bit lower oxygen in the summer completely naturally without humans, human interaction at all. Although these seasonal hypoxic events can definitely be enhanced, exacerbated by human impacts. And finally, if the eutrophication is bad enough, if there's an actual dead zone, it can lead to anoxia, so no oxygen in the environment. And so what we can see is that when there is a normal level of oxygen in the marine environment, it can support this sustainable climax community of benthic organisms. But every summer, again, completely naturally, there is a decrease in oxygen because of algal blooms, because of additional nutrients washing into the waterways, because of course there's a lot more biomass, there's a lot more production during the summer, more nutrients are going to be dislodged, and so there's going to be a decrease in oxygen within the marine environment. Of course, also warmer water doesn't hold as much oxygen, so in general, lower oxygen during the summer season. And so we might see a little bit of a shift away from this nice climax community here, closer down to this transitional group 2 community, depending on how bad the hypoxia gets, right? So we can see that here, when the environment is truly hypoxic, the decrease or the change in community is going to be much more pronounced from this climax community to the transitional community. And of course, in the event of a dead zone, which we learned a lot about earlier this semester and through this paper, when there is a true dead zone, none of these organisms from group 2 or group 3 can survive. They need a certain amount of oxygen. And so these hypoxic or anoxic conditions essentially act like a disturbance, and they rewind the clock, right, all the way back to this group 1 community, which then, of course, over the fall, over the winter, over the spring, if there is enough oxygen that has returned to the community, succession can take place again. And so for the next season, maybe, the community will be at this mature or contain these mature species once again. And so hopefully that makes sense for you guys. Just another way of looking at this and yet another example of succession. Again, this is autogenic because the organisms themselves are creating changes in the environment that lead to the change in community composition. Allogenic, on the other hand, is an environmental change that is a result of purely the physical environment. So not what trees are growing, not what benthic invertebrates are growing, but purely environmental changes themselves. So for example, as you increase in elevation, as you're driving up a mountain, you can see changes over space and maybe even over time. And so this decline in temperature is allogenic. It has nothing to do with the organisms themselves. There's going to be a decrease in temperature as you increase in elevation, regardless of what species are present. Also, we know that there's a decrease in water temperature as you go deeper and deeper into the water column. Again, this has nothing to do with the organisms living in these environments and everything to do with the environment itself. Of course, there are additional allogenic changes, such as climate change and changes in landscape or wetlands or aquatic environments, either driven by humans or by other natural physical events. And so one example I want to give you of this allogenic um, succession or zonation is riparian sediment deposition over time. And so what I want to point out here is that rivers aren't always in the same place, right? So if you look at a map of the Greater Escarpment River, the Mullica River from 300 years ago, it wouldn't be in the exact same place that it is today. It's constantly changing, and there's a very predictable way that it does change. So this image over here on the left is showing a river flowing, right, flowing in this direction. As the river meanders, the outside of the curve, right, outside of the bend in the river, that water is going to be moving faster than the water on the inside of the curve. And so what that does is, well, two things. First of all, on the outside of a curve, this really quickly moving water is going to erode the bank. It's going to be cutting into the soil on the outer side of the river, particularly in a super sandy place like South Jersey. It just takes longer if there's more rock. Secondly, on the inside of the curve, because the water is flowing so slowly, relatively slowly, particulates, sand, silt, clay, debris can precipitate out of the water and deposit on the inside of the bank. And so what that does is it pushes the river farther, in our case, to the right, right? So pushes the river farther to the right because it's essentially building bank on the inside and it's cutting away bank on the outside of the curve. And so over time, the river's meandering is going to get more and more and more extreme. Right? So much so that if you look at maps of rivers around here, all of them wind very sharply. And if you've ever gone kayaking in the Pine Barrens, you know just how much the rivers meander back and forth, sometimes pretty sharply. And of course, there is some strategy associated with whether you take your boat on this side or on the inner side. Sometimes, or eventually, in fact, this meandering gets so wide that it is maybe a little bit easier for water to not go way around and following the river path, but instead to kind of take a shortcut, right? Water is always going to follow the path of least resistance. And so if maybe the water level gets too high after a storm, now all of a sudden, maybe it can cut through this bank here. And so that's what we can see up here, this meandering river, right? The neck becomes narrower and narrower, and eventually the river kind of cuts off this loop. And sometimes it leaves a little lake behind called an oxbow lake, and the river is straight or straighter than it was before, right? Kind of reverting back to the way it was before. And so when we look at a meandering river, a meandering stream, we can see that it changes over time. Sometimes there is some evidence of where the river was previously. Okay? And so at any given point in this landscape, sometimes the point is underwater, sometimes sediment is being deposited, sometimes it's being eroded. Right? Sometimes it is just land, right? Not actually submerged underwater either. And so again, this is an allogenic effect. This is purely a physical process and has nothing to do with who is living in the river. And kind of an interesting example of this, I think, is the Mississippi River. Of course, the Mississippi is flowing through a pretty flat part of North America. And so there's nothing that is kind of containing it into a pretty small space. Like you can think of the Grand Canyon, the river can't really meander that much because there's rock on either side. But in the Great Plains, Mississippi River can move at will. And so what this map is showing us is a series of locations where the river used to be over time, we can see that it has changed considerably. Each one of these different colors is a different time. Another example I want to show you, and this one hopefully will actually be moving for you, but um, NASA took images over a period from 1988 to 2018, and it compiled them into an animation in Bangladesh. And there we go. So what we can see here is the river, again, meandering. It is changing places over time. And so, we can see logically how this makes sense. And I just want you to think about how the soils change as the river changes place. So again, if we are thinking about a point right here where the mouse is, right? Sometimes this point is underwater, sometimes it's not. Sometimes sediments are being deposited, nutrients are being deposited, other times they're washing away. We can think about vegetation, right? So again, this river moving in space is going to act essentially like a disturbance, right? Sometimes vegetation that is adapted to being submerged in water can live, but then other times this a particular area of land is going to be drier. And so again, disturbance over time. And really, this is just over 30 years. It's really not that long of a time at all. And so in the river valley here, maybe slow growing plants can't make it. They can't survive because of the relatively frequent disturbance regime. One final thing I want you to think about is how humans just love to build stuff right next to the river. And then, of course, people's houses get flooded, people's crops wash away. You know, People build their multi-million-dollar homes right there on the beach, but really these natural processes are continually disturbing these areas. And so our human structures can be very much damaged, or if we build structures that restrict the rivers or restrict the ocean encroaching on barrier islands or on the mainland, it's just a lot of work and energy intensive and surely not natural to pretty much eliminate this disturbance regime by building human structures right next to the water. Right. So in this river valley in Bangladesh, maybe it would make more sense to have your house over here where the river is not going to encroach upon it. Okay. And one final example here of these allogenic um, processes that drive succession are lakes. Right? So we've talked about oceans, we've talked about rivers, but lakes as well. So lacustrine means lake. And here we can see an open water lake. Over time, dead plant matter, dead animal matter is going to accumulate. Also, any runoff from the surrounding environment, sediments are going to accumulate over time, and the lake can get shallower and shallower until eventually it is filled in. Okay, so just one final example for you there. Thank you guys so much for watching this series of 3 videos. Look forward to seeing you again soon.